Hi, I'm Diana Thompson, and I'm the Director of Collections and Curatorial Affairs at the National Academy of Design in New York. The National Academy of Design is the leading honorary society for visual arts and architecture in the United States. We're here behind the scenes for the installation of our exhibition For America here at the Society of the Four Arts in Palm Beach, Florida. The show covers over 200 years. The earliest painting in the show dates to around 1809 and it goes through today. It's organized around a concept of pairs. One type would be the artist's portrait paired with their representative work.
The question of why the National Academy of Design required portraits is actually a very difficult question because we don't know the answer to it. One of the theories we think is that this was a way of defining yourself to your peers. You know, you wanted to have an image of yourself that was for posterity, that people could look at, that people could think about. And then when new members came on, they saw this as a tradition, a living tradition spread out before them. My name is Jeremiah McCarthy, and I'm the curator of the exhibition For America. What's really fascinating about the portrait requirement is that the only stipulation was it needed to be a portrait. So it could be a self-portrait, it could be a portrait by someone who is already a National Academician, or it could be a portrait that someone painted or sculpted outside of the organization. And you can trace artists' relationships through the portraits because as people start to ask their peers to paint their portraits, you start to get these interesting stories. I mean, like William Glackens painted the portrait of Ernest Lawson, and when he gave him the portrait, Lawson said, "Oh, I never really realized my face was that hard to paint."
So as far as early 19th century portraits in the show, I would really love to tell a little story about our portrait of Samuel Morse. So it's the earliest work in the show, and I think when people think of Samuel Morse, they think of Morse the inventor. But he in fact had a very prolific career as an artist in his earlier years. In this portrait, when you look at it, it's a small portrait on ivory. The artist is not even 20 years old, and he is depicting himself already as an accomplished artist. It's incredible what can be done on a small miniature ivory painting.
Another great example is the relationship between Robert Blum and William Merritt Chase. We have in this exhibition, you'll see a painting by William Merritt Chase called The Young Orphan, which is unquestionably one of his masterpieces. It's on the cover of his monograph. It's lauded the world over. But people forget that when Chase was displaying his work, he faced really intense criticism of critics saying that his figures were too wooden. There was no life in a lot of the paintings. And so he painted Robert Blum's portrait. And Robert Blum had heterochromia, where you have one eye a different color from the other. And when you look there and you stand in front of this painting, you sort of see his soul beating in his eyes. And it's a challenge to sort of anyone to say, if William Merritt Chase couldn't paint, you know, life in a figure, here's this incredible portrait of his very dear friend. It's a really moving portrait.
Charles White is one of the most important 20th century American artists whose work focused on the triumphs and the struggles of the African American community. And we were really fortunate to have the opportunity for this show to conserve a work by his that tells a very personal, poignant story. And it's a portrait of his great aunt, Hasty Baines. She was born into slavery in 1857 on the Yellowleaf Plantation in Mississippi. There's a letter that Charles White's wife wrote shortly after the artist's death, where she explains that Hasty Baines, for White, served as this symbol of courage and wisdom. And these are universal themes that White explored throughout his entire career in his work.
I think that when visitors come to this exhibition and they enter the first space, they're going to see portraits that are very homogeneous. They're going to see people who look very similar. And as they move through the exhibition, they're going to see the Academy change just as America changes. They're going to see the rise of women artists. They're going to see the rise of artists of color. And then by the time they get to the final section of the exhibition, they're going to see something which I hope looks more like the America we have today than the America of the past. You know, when you stand in the final gallery, which we're in, you have a self-portrait by a Native American artist, you have a self-portrait by an Icelandic woman who called New York her home, you have a self-portrait by a Chinese American artist, you have all of these different viewpoints and they come together, and it shows you really that, like, the more viewpoints you bring, the richer the dialogue.